It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Welcome, fellow Quillers, to another fun and exciting episode. My guest today is Shane Squarick, fellow podcaster and super sleuth known to his listeners and followers as the Conspiracy Realist, which is also the name of his popular podcast series. Shane, welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger.
Hey, I appreciate you having me here. I don't know if I can live up to the expectations of super sleuth, but I'll certainly try my best here.
Did I pronounce your last name correctly? Because sometimes I have difficulty with that with some of my guests, so I want to make sure I have it correct.
You nailed it, and I'm sort of accustomed to, the listeners out there can't actually see how it's spelt unless you're maybe looking at your screens right now, but I'm accustomed to people butchering it, and I've been called everything from squirrel to Skywalker. So not only am I impressed that you nailed my last name, but you didn't even have it. I know. I get that all the time.
That'll be my new conspiracy theory, is that somebody has stolen the vowels out of your last name.
Whenever they migrated here to the United States from Poland, they signed their name and they must have scribbled something on there, and whoever did the paperwork left something off.
Kind of like the man from Stratford, didn't know how to spell his own name, spelled it 3 different ways in 6 signatures. So there you have it.
All right. Perfect parlay.
Before we dive into too many things, tell my listeners a little bit about your podcast, Conspiracy Realist. What's it about? Why would it be interesting to Shakespearean super sleuths like me and the Fold in the Quiller Nation? Tell us a little bit about the series.
Yeah, definitely. So the Conspiracy Realist started just a few months ago as a buddy of mine, Tim, and we'd be playing a lot of Xbox late at night because the kids were in bed. The wives kind of maybe conked out or left us alone for a little while. And we got really into just looking at conspiracy theories across the spectrum. Nothing in specifically. We just had fun while we were playing some Xbox, just, chatting up about different things. The thing that we always found when we were diving into any one of these conspiracies is that every conspiracy theory show that we found or any theory you tried to research sort of assumed that you knew everything about it or sort of tied in 25 other conspiracies into it. And so that was always hard for us to kind of navigate through because, one, we didn't quite have the time to sit there and sift through pages and pages and pages worth of context just to kind of get an answer to basic questions. And beyond that, we weren't really interested in learning about, the 25 spin-off theories. We wanted to know kind of about that core theory. And so what we were doing while we were on Xbox is kind of breaking it down. And so we'd look at a topic, we'd kind of pick that topic apart, and then just ask ourselves really basic questions, try to do some research on it if we could, and then posture our own ideas. One day, we got the bright idea to record ourselves to do it. And here we are now. We've got, I think we're on episode 120. We started episode 100. Time is a construct. That was always our patch on there. So we've actually recorded 20 separate episodes. And we've done just that. We've kind of positioned it so it's conspiracy theories for the everyman, for your average person who doesn't quite want to be classified in that like tinfoil hat area, but is really interested in learning a little bit more about it. And that's kind of been the reaction from friends and family, particularly, that have come up to us and said, hey, I saw that stuff you guys have been posting on YouTube. I'm really interested in this. And it's been kind of shocking to us too, because I've been approached by people I've known the bulk of my life that would never in a million years would I tie them into being interested in these conspiracy theories. And yet here they are asking me my opinions on this or that. And it's just, it kind of validated what we thought going into this, that there was a little bit of a need to be able to talk to people like that weren't so entrenched in it. Because, when you go on Twitter or anywhere on the internet, sometimes when you look at a conspiracy theory, it's everything's the end of the world and they're all out to get you. And it becomes daunting instead of fun. We wanted to kind of keep it fun.
So this series is not for the Holden Caulfields of the world. We don't expect that you're going to have a bunch of would-be assassins listening to the podcast, but it's more about.
I'm hoping not.
It's more about sharing with mystery buffs, I would say, maybe, because most conspiracies have either two elements to them, I think. One is that there's some sort of mystery or unexplained or unanswered question or series of questions around a topic that lead to people coming up with theories about their answers to that. Or it has something to do with, like you say, us versus them. There's somebody hiding the truth or hiding a secret for some nefarious reason, or maybe it's not even nefarious. Maybe it's just political reason that the truth is being hidden or suppressed from the public eye.
Yeah. I think you nailed it.
Well, I've been doing this for a while. So we know how it all began, but tell me, what was the big one? What was the big question that like kind of started it all? What was the one that had your minds going and you went, the questions that I have about this topic that I'd like to find answers to or tell people about is Kennedy or aliens or what was the big like boom debut topic?
So it wasn't the debut topic. I guess it was in a way, because our opening episodes sort of covered an array of topics that we thought were really cool, that we knew we'd cover in depth down the line. And I mean, timeliness couldn't have been more perfect because we just released this topic while we're recording this, you and I, a couple days ago from when we're recording this. So I'm not sure when this is going to air, but it'll be very recent to this. And that for me was time travel with a person by the name of John Teeter. Captivated me. For those unaware of who John Teeter was, it captivated me many, many years ago, probably in, I want to say like 2003, 2004 is when I first became turned on to it. Effectively, what he was a time traveler that traveled back to the year 2001. He was from the year 2036, and he started posting on message boards saying he's a time traveler and answering people's questions. The internet in that era was very different than the internet now. You couldn't quite look up people like you can today and find everything you wanted to know about them. And so message boards were your social media form of that time. I'm not going to bore you with all the specifics of everything that went down there, but what stood out to me about that specific topic was the parallels of his predictions, so to speak. And you call them predictions. I guess they're not quite that because he's supposed to be a time traveler, right? To what ends up happening in modern day today. They talk about elections and questions about the validity of them. They talk about a disease, a mad cow-like disease, which we obviously paralleled that in 2020. They talk about potential World War III that starts to break out, which we teeter on that all the time, but particularly right now, it seems to align. His timeline was probably about 10 or 12 years ago. It kind of started around 2008, 2012, 2015 versus right now, where it's really for us 2018, 2020, 2025. But it still seemed to align item after item. What also captivated me was the way he responded to the questions, because he was on the message boards for about 2 years. And he provided images of what his time travel device was, which was put into an old like 1960s Chevy. And they were real pictures of whatever this device was. They had technical drawings all written up. They had logos. None of that was ever disproven or dispelled. So that was always interesting. And then when people would ask him questions about, if you're a time traveler, tell me who won the Super Bowl this year, or tell me who won the World Series. And the way he answered a lot of these questions always got me thinking. He's like, you have a time traveler at your disposal right here. And the only question you could think of is to ask a sports game. So I'll ask you, who won the World Series last year? And the average person has no idea.
Right. I was going to say those are the kind of details that I don't know that I would have if let's say I traveled back in time and people started asking me those questions. I don't know if I would be able to answer. I would probably say
I don't know either.
Well, I know the Kansas City Chiefs were on a run and that pissed me off. So that's about all I can tell you.
It'd be a pretty good guess. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not, but it's a pretty good guess. But that's what really struck to me is, I mean, he answered everything very succinctly. You can go back and still see all the logs of all those forum posts. They're readily available. They're archived on the internet. Websites have archived them too. But I became so obsessed with that over the years. It's always lingered in the back of my mind. It's one of those things where you really want to believe it. You kind of know that it's probably not true, but it's fun to think about it. And that's what I've always thought conspiracy theory should be.
Well, I would think that
not
if you were a time traveler and you went back in time and you were telling people about a virus that was coming, you would remember the name COVID. There would be no way that you wouldn't remember, hey, by the way, there's this thing coming called COVID. I think every human being on the planet knows the word COVID. And if they traveled back in time and could warn people about it, they would know that detail at least. So I think, there's some sort of suspect there to me. But maybe this guy was, like a Nostradamus type who was looking into some gazing ball or gazing bowl of some sort and indulging in herbs of a different kind, because pretty much we have pretty good evidence that Nostradamus was dabbling in potions and things and maybe was having visions from those potions.
Right.
And so, I would think that perhaps this guy was that type of a person and just masking it with time travel. That would be there's my theory.
Hey, I like it. That would have been a nice angle to kind of filter into that too.
At least he wasn't,
it's one of those things too, where
he wasn't blogging in quatrains at least. So that's cool.
It's one of those weird things too, where sometimes we want to find truth in things that aren't quite true. And I often ask myself that is like, is my desire for the idea of time travel to be true? Why maybe I sometimes blank out the holes that are in his story, right? Because if time travel is true, then I can go out and find out all the answers to all this stuff. So maybe that's why it's always lingered in the back of my mind for so long.
Well, I have a theory that aliens are actually time travelers. The little green men, the little
humans from the future,
the grays, they call them, right? With the big giant eyes and tiny little mouths and tiny little ear holes and huge 3-fingered hands, but hardly any body to speak of. I'm convinced that's what we are going to evolve into. That's what we're going to look like in the future. And that's us coming back to take a look at how the hell did we get there? And and part of it is
theory before.
I mean, look at it. We have these giant fingers and giant eyes because we're glued to screens all day long. We can't take our faces away from them. So eventually our eyes are going to get bigger. Our ears are going to only need to be large enough to stick earbuds in. And our mouths aren't going to be necessary because we'll be typing everything all the time. So our fingers have to get bigger and more accurate. And our bodies will be atrophied. And so that's my theory, is those are just humans. They're not actually aliens. They're humans thousands of years in the future coming back to find out what the hell went wrong.
It's funny because you look at what's going on today in modern culture, and you have Elon Musk, who is sitting there creating Neuralink, their brain implants that right now are really just helping people that have effectively paraplegics that have no bodily functions to be able to use a computer. The end goal, the end result of a Neuralink is to be able to download intelligence into your brain. The actual technology there it's working is they're wiring into your brain. I listened to part of an 8-hour podcast that Lex Friedman had with the Neuralink group. It is a very long one. So it's in a lot of doses. I've got to listen to it. But they describe the technology. There's videos of how they do it. It's literally like these little like itsy bitsy like hair string wires that are connecting to the neurons in your brain. And so 10 years from now, maybe longer, but let's say hypothetically 10 years from now, you might be able to, anybody with any disability, they'll be able to correct that. They're doing that right now. But now you can start to create almost superhumans. So to your point is, our bodies start to atrophy. We start to communicate through these devices. We might not even need the earbuds, which is why you don't see a present alien. We could just be putting implants in the back of our brain, and then all our communication is for, oversimplifying it, but digital, right? It's all through this wireless channel. And that's where they say that they have telekinesis, and they're talking, I guess, through your minds, right?
Well, they're Bluetoothing
Maybe that's
each
how
other.
it is. Maybe it's the technology.
They're
Exactly.
Bluetoothing each
back
other.
and
That's
forth
what
to
it
each other.
is, right?
Right. So maybe that is the case. And I've also heard that maybe Earth fails in the future, it dies off, and aliens are just humans that have bumped to another planet, and their bodies atrophied because the gravity's different there, and you don't need as much strength. You could see that on the moon as it is. Just being in space, your body's atrophied quite a bit. So it's interesting. Yeah, I like that theory a lot. Again, it's one of those ones that I kind of hope aren't true, because I want to think that there's more to the universe and that we're going to go full Star Wars or Star Trek and be able to travel over the place. But I think it's just as plausible that is the reality of human nature here.
Well, it is very true to kind of come back down to earth for a minute. It is very true, though, that there are so many instances in history where science fiction has become science fact. And in many cases, there is sort of a chicken egg argument. Like if you look at the invention of the flip phone, just as an example, the flip phone was designed by engineers who designed it because they loved Star Trek. And they wanted to replicate the flip communicators from the original Star Trek series. So science fiction becomes science fact sometimes because it is a discovery, sometimes because it's planned to be so. I mean, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and look at the nuclear submarines we have today. Did submarine designers try to invent the Nautilus off of Wells's description? Maybe not, but certainly it was a matter of discovery and advancement that was fueled by someone's imagination that then inspired someone else's imagination. And I think that's how science fiction becomes science fact so often. You look at Leonardo da Vinci's designs of helicopters and the helicopters we now have today. That kind of a thing tends to be, someone says this can happen. We just need technology to catch up to the idea. And it happens quite often. We have robotics. We have, these walking, talking android creatures now that no one even 40 years ago would have believed we would have right now. But that were popping up in our science fiction films all the time. And so it's funny when you talk about this time traveler guy, and he created a time machine out of a Chevy rather than a DeLorean, but he is sort of a Dr. Emmett Brown, right? I mean, so there you go.
Yep. Yeah. It's, I work in technology, so I often wonder sometimes when we're tackling technological problems, technological advancements, if we are not blinded by that same science fiction, our obsession with trying to emulate our favorite science fiction series. It seems almost like we take lessons in physics and in just the evolution of technology from science fiction. Whereas, we saw it on Star Trek, it was the flip phone. So we create the flip phone and we create it to that spec. Whereas like maybe there was a better design at the time that we just ignored because that wasn't on Star Trek. It's not what we wanted, right? I've thought about that a lot in like the development of aircraft and rockets and any of these major technological advances. Why are we doing it this method? Is that because that's sort of what was pounded into our head? Like you said, it was like a chicken or the egg. Where did it come from? Was that the evolution of technology? Is that the best way to do it? And the Hollywood filmmakers previously just did a lot of research on it, or are we doing it because that's what we think is the right way to do? So, it's an interesting thought.
There's a
it's why I
great
love
series.
This whole arena of mystery.
There's a great series, or maybe it's not a series, but like a 2-hour documentary or something. I don't recall the details of it, but I remember watching it on Nat Geo or Discovery Channel or one of those. And the title, and I think it's hosted by Bill Shatner. and it's
Mhm.
called How Star Trek Changed the World. And they
Ooh, okay.
go through. You should look it up. I think you would enjoy it, and I think my listeners
yeah.
would enjoy it as well. How Star Trek Changed the World, and what they do is they actually go through all of these technological advances, and they profile the people who were responsible for them. You know, this engineer, this computer scientist, this medical engineer professional, and they go through and profile these people. And what they point out is in every single case, they were a Star Trek nerd. They grew up loving Star Trek. And when asked in interviews later in life, where did you come up with this idea? They credited Gene Roddenberry. And that's like the premise of the show is that these Star Trek nerds all grew up to become very advanced scientists who started creating new technology. And they did it because they were inspired by watching the 1960s television series. And it's a really fascinating documentary to watch.
That sounds fun. Yeah.
Yeah, including the guy who invented like the first Texas Instruments computers. I'm old enough to remember the old TIs that had the green screen and everything was green. And that guy did that because of the Star Trek characters looking into the screens and their faces glowing blue. So like when Lieutenant Uhura is like raising comms and there's a blue light shining on her, the guy who that was what inspired that guy. That's one of the things I remember from the documentary.
That's interesting because I read just recently that all computer monitors are made with blue light now, which is why you see the blue light glasses. And I think the science has said that blue light's not very good for you. It disrupts your sleep patterns and so forth. But there was an opportunity that they can build these screens without the blue light. And for whatever reason, they just chose to stick with blue light. I don't know the technological reasons for it or the decision behind it, but they could have done the exact same thing with very little difference in picture with red light or whatever other light wouldn't have been so disruptive. And they never did. So again, one of those things where I wonder if there was a mindset behind it, if it was just a cost thing maybe, or if there really was just an inspiration at some point. And once, you know how things are, once somebody does it, nobody else kind of changes it because,
well, Shane, don't you know it's because it's addictive and they want you trapped to the screen. There's my conspiracy theory. Boom. New one right there.
I agree with that. Social media is built for that. The longer you stay on the computer, the more likely you are to buy something or make somebody money. So
now I can think off the top of my head of like, I don't know, maybe a handful, maybe even if I were hard pressed, maybe up to a dozen conspiracy theories. But what happens when the ones in your head run out? Where do you go find them? How do you find topics and seek out different subject matters for your episodes?
It's funny you asked that because before I started doing this, right as I was about to do the first one, I was a part of a masterclass or a mastermind group, which I joined solely because I was looking for the networking opportunity to talk to more like-minded entrepreneurs. As it turns out, almost everybody in that group was a podcaster, except for me at that time, at least. The person that ran the group, very successful, 500,000 followers on YouTube, similar across his other social media channels, very well respected in like the pro wrestling industry, which I'm a big fan of that. And he had asked me the same question when I told him that this is what we're going to do. And he said, aren't there a limit on conspiracy theories? And I thought, sure, there are. But we'll get to that when we can. For right now, I'm just going to have fun with it. And I only ever anticipated it just being me and my friend just kind of shooting the breeze. As we went into it, it didn't take us more than one single episode to start to discover that there's probably a lot more here than we think. I'm not going to dive too deep into this, but have you ever heard of MK Ultra?
No.
Okay, so MK Ultra was an actual mind control experiment by the CIA. Again, it's a conspiracy, but it's a proven conspiracy. I mean, you can look up all the records on it. So there was a conspiracy theory right there, and that is one we wanted to tackle. That was our one of our first episodes that we came out with. It was a really interesting one to me that was fascinating. Well, within MK Ultra, they actually had two other ones that spun off of that. One before MK Ultra was Operation Paperclip. Okay, so that's popped up. There's Operation, oh God, we always used to call it Operation Asparagus. That's not the one, and I can't think of what it's called right now. Yes. But there was all these other operations that basically, once they'd be exposed or sort of ran their course or they found out a certain information, they'd be sunset completely. I bring up Operation Paperclip because Operation Paperclip is where the first doses of LSD were synthesized. Okay, so in a government program, a CIA-led program, there we go. Okay, so now,
right. Well, that's historical fact, right? Like we know for a fact now that the CIA was administering drugs to people using human guinea pigs. We know that to be absolute truth. And it's one of the reasons why in today's day and age, when we talk about things like the deep state, there's a lot of plausibility to that because our government has done some pretty horrendous things in the shadows and gotten away with a lot of crap that we probably still haven't even scratched the surface of.
And that's it exactly, is once you start going down those rabbit holes, one thing leads to another. What they did in Operation Paperclip by basically drugging people with LSD directly correlates now to MK Ultra when they were trying to mind control people to do things. We then find out that Ted Kaczynski was participating in Harvard University experiments with LSD and mind control. And then what does he go end up doing? So then we spin the MK Ultra off into a podcast about, which ended up being the subject matter for that one, but that one ends up being the correlation between a lot of the serial killers or mass murderers of that kind of that 70s, 80s, and like early 90s period to MK Ultra. And a serial killer had ties to the military. John Wayne Gacy, the one famous for the clown picture, even though he wasn't a clown, had ties to the military. Jeffrey Dahmer, popularized now because of the Netflix series, ties to the military. So now the question becomes, were these all products of MK Ultra? And you start to find other derivatives of that. So there are a limited number of conspiracies that I knew off the top of my head, but every single one can kind of branch off into another. And I can't help but thinking of that. If you ever see like an old detective show or X-Files, you see that big bulletin board and you've got the strings connecting from one piece of paper to the next all over the place. And you look like that literally crazy tinfoil conspiracy guy. But that's how it starts to go. And there's different things you could branch off on.
I have always wondered, because I remember growing up, excuse me, I remember growing up through the 80s. Those were pretty much my formative years, adolescence and high school years. I graduated high school in 1989. And I remember through the 80s particularly, and then looking back at it later on, doing research for a play I was producing, discovering that the 1980s, from the late 70s, somewhere around 76 to right around 92, but we'll call that the 80s decade. There were more serial killers in that span of time than all of combined American history. And then they just stopped. They just disappeared and they weren't happening anymore. It was, in fact, the 1980s, if you look at the statistics, the 1980s was one of the most violent decades in all of American history. Murders, rapes, serial killers. I mean, it was a super, super violent time in American history. A lot of people only think about it as this time of economic prosperity, Reaganomics, and the Cold War coming to an end and that kind of a thing. But domestically, it was horrid. There was a lot of craziness going on. Some of it was because of the closure of medical facilities that dealt with mental health. And so suddenly we ended up with a lot of crazy people out on the streets. But it was a really weird phenomenon that during that, let's call it 12 to 15 years, there were so many, mostly men, a couple of women, but mostly men out there preying upon victims and killing 10, 12, 15, as many as 20 people during their reign of terror. And then it just stopped.
Yeah.
It's really strange how it just ended. And now, like, to find a serial killer now is so rare and few and far between.
Right. Right. Yeah. Now it's shifted to like the mass murderer type thing. But the common thread in all of it, back in the 80s, it always felt like everyone had charisma. Like Ted Bundy, for all intents and purposes, I mean, nice looking guy, had no problem meeting a woman. Um, but he went and met a bunch of them shadily and killed them. Why? Like it didn't add up to me. John Wayne Gacy was very successful politician, very well liked in his town, but then would attract young boys back to his house, kill them and throw them in his basement or underneath his house. Made no sense. And then you look even to more modern times, the Las Vegas shooter that happened at Mandalay Bay. And I haven't touched this in an episode yet. It's one of the ones that we hope to do. And that's where we tie kind of into modern MK Ultra is here's a guy, and you see this a lot with a lot of these people, is they have absolutely no history of violence, of even a parking ticket. And all of a sudden, one day, there's this crazed person, they snap and something catastrophic happens. Could be complete coincidence, straight to the core. But that's one of those things that I've always found it interesting to investigate. It's just, it strikes me as way too out of the ordinary for somebody that has charisma and is well liked in the community to snap and have this really, really dark side. It also strikes me as somebody that really has no history of violence or no history of any sort of difficulty with the law. Again, just snapping and doing something catastrophic like that. When you look at some of the people that have a history of being bullied or beat up on or picked on or really had it hard, not that I'm empathizing with them, but I can understand that a little bit better because it's a series of events that sort of broke that person down, right? And so I've often wondered, what, knowing what we know about what the government has actively done, which is out there you could find, which triggered all these things, and are there new programs? We see about social engineering all the time and how social media is used to manipulate the way you think, how Russia has bot farms, and the US does the same thing in other countries as well. But there's all these bot farms to kind of change people's perspectives and manipulate the algorithms. Is that a modern day way of MK Ultra where you don't have to drug somebody, you can change their opinion and get them angry just by feeding them negative content? Don't know.
So I would argue
the rabbit holes I enjoy going down.
I would argue that the reason that this is relevant to the Shakespeare authorship mystery is because what we're talking about is a secretive government control of topics or influences over the populace. And I believe that the Shakespeare authorship mystery is a deep state story at a time when it was much easier to have a deep state. Totalitarian authority was, the age of the day. And so here you have a government that is controlled by a group of elitists who have control over the narrative. They have control over all media outlets. They have control over the propaganda machine that they have created and now want to suppress the details of, which I believe that many of the works of Shakespeare are part of Elizabethan propaganda, meant to control the narrative, meant to influence the populace against Spain and for Elizabeth and make them all loyal nationalists to the English cause at a time of great turmoil and strife, a time when they were trying to suppress one religious belief over another. I mean, these things are so common through the history of mankind. And as you point out, still occurring today in our very world that we live in. And so when you connect those dots together, it becomes so much easier to see how the Shakespeare authorship mystery could be an example of that. And then, is that so much of a conspiracy, or is it truly the exposing of a government-controlled narrative, which we're seeing happening right now in our very lives? The exposing of government-controlled narratives are happening left and right all around us over the last 4 or 5 years.
You asked me a few minutes ago, what happens when I run out of conspiracies that I'm aware of. And that's how I came across the Shakespearean authorship conspiracy. I had no idea this existed. All I knew of Shakespeare is what I learned in school. It's a guy that wrote a bunch of plays that I had to read and study and go see 100 times. And by the time I was done with school, it drove me crazy. And then they made about 300 variations of Romeo and Juliet and Othello and so forth and called him different things. He's basically impacted culture, pop culture in many ways. That was the end of it. It was in a mindless scroll of Twitter that I had come across the posts by Alan Tarica, who ended up being a guest on our show and enlightened us to some of the conspiracy here. And he sent me some documentation to read through first. He's like, listen, before I come on and just kind of like spew my thoughts to you guys, I want you to read this stuff and just see if it's something you're interested in. And then what you just described is exactly the way I felt. The parallels that we have in that Elizabethan era to today they're uncanny. And the greatest indicator of the future is looking to the past. It's that old quote: if you don't pay attention to the past, you're doomed to repeat it, or something to that degree. And that's what I felt. It's like we're literally seeing the corruption. We're seeing a story of betrayal and quite frankly propaganda the whole way through. It kind of opened my mind to something that there's a conspiracy in everything, I guess, to a degree. But yeah, it was fascinating to me, and it kind of got me hooked in there right away.
So that's how I found you, was that I saw that episode. I watched it on YouTube.
Oh, awesome.
Rather than just listen to it. So I watched the episode on YouTube, and I watched you and your partner host sort of get lured into this, and I sat there while and Alan's also been a guest of my podcast as well in the past. And as I watched him like lead you down the path, I kept sitting there going, oh, these poor guys, they don't have any clue what is about to happen to them.
No.
And by the end of it, I could tell that there were at least 4 to 5 areas of exploration that you were about to dive into some deep rabbit holes. And that's what caused me to reach out to you. And one of the questions then I have for you right now is, what has happened to you on this topic since then? And how many like horribly deep rabbit holes have you found yourself at the bottom of since being introduced to this topic?
So I like to do a lot of research in advance of having a guest, in part because when we started this, I never anticipated ever having a guest at all. And so the fact that people wanted to come talk to my co-host and I was incredibly humbling, but also flooring. I wanted to make sure I wasn't completely lost. I listened to the episode that he did on your show here, and that was some background information. So I went in there kind of with a little bit of basis. A lot of my rabbit hole diving was then. I think my biggest light bulb moment was in the middle of the episode, and you might even be able to see the expression on my face. Is Alan talked a lot about Ed DeVere and his relationship with Queen Elizabeth, that spawning a child and so forth. Talked about how the sonnets in reverse sort of explore the exploration of that. Then I started to think about what I'm familiar with. That's Shakespeare's plays. And I did more research into this afterwards. And even before this episode that we're recording right now, I wanted to refresh myself on anything. And so I looked up a couple other pieces. And I broke down Shakespeare's plays. I didn't break it down. It's already broken down that way, but into 3 eras, right? The early plays, kind of that middle tier plays, and then the late plays. And thematically, again, going with the Ed DeVere relationship as what the conspiracy is that I'm familiar with and that I'm now subscribing to. Thematically, those early plays, look at Romeo and Juliet or Midsummer's Night Dream. What are the themes? Forbidden love, Romeo and Juliet. Ed DeVere and Queen Elizabeth, they can't love because they're not meant to be loved. Their love has to be hidden. If anybody finds out, it's going to cause chaos. Midsummer Night's Dream. What's the theme there? It's love, the complications of love. Very interesting. A lot of parallels I would draw there. That kind of mid-tier plays. Caesar. What's the theme of Caesar? Betrayal. It's the biggest act of betrayal in, I think, any sort of literature across the world. Hamlet, what's the theme there? It's revenge, it's justice. Okay, so now if you subscribe to the fact that Ed de Vere was behind some of the writings here, he's writing his love letters to Queen Elizabeth in Romeo and Juliet, Midsummer's Night Dream, some of those early plays. Those next batch of plays, he feels betrayed. He's starting to get bitter because she's turning him away. She doesn't want to be involved with him anymore. She's not acknowledging they have a child. So there's the betrayal. There's the revenge. There's the justice. He's starting to get pissed. His late plays, Othello, main theme is deceit. Macbeth, the main theme is corruption and power. So now you're looking at that latter stage. Now he is bitter. He feels like he's been betrayed completely, and he feels like he's been left in the dirt, and Queen Elizabeth has completely deceived everybody, and she's in a thirst for power rather than acknowledging their love. That to me was just, I don't know, that's a better story than everything I've read and everything I've seen from Shakespeare throughout all of culture. It's this almost deterioration of this mind. And again, this is all speculation. Of course, we are not going to be able to definitively prove any of this, but just the way the tones and the themes of all these stories evolved over time. And I know that sometimes there's some discrepancy on when they were written, but if you take them at what it's worth there, it tells that same story. It tells what you would feel being heartbroken in a relationship. I mean, think back to whenever you got your own heart broken. And I think back to high school
Which
eras
time?
And having that happen. And you know, that right, exactly. Which time? Pick any of them.
Right? Pick one.
Yeah, it's just
the first one,
that
the
to me
third
was
one.
the biggest rabbit hole. And so see, you can write a series of plays like that, and then maybe somebody will posture about this several hundred years from now as well.
Well, and I think, you've touched on what so many people, when they discovered this mystery, have also discovered, which is that there's one story we've been told that just absolutely doesn't fit anything. And then there are these other potential characters who may have been the author or involved in the writing of the plays, and their lives overlay. And of all of them, his overlays the most. So either he's the writer, or the writer was writing his biography through the plays. I have started to come to believe more and more that there was definitely a cabal of writers. We know this for a fact. We know that Edward de Vere had around him and surrounded himself with quality writers of his day and supported them. And there's no other nobleman in Elizabethan history who has more books dedicated to him or more prefatory essays written by him or about him or to him. So he was the lead sponsor of publications of his time and supported a lot of these up and coming writers. And so I'm tending to lean more and more towards that. There were times when he sat down with them and said, okay, we need to write a play. And here's what the general gist of the play is going to be. And I have this story, but I need a secondary story. Anthony Munday, what do you got? John Lilly, what do you got? Give me some ideas. Throw your stuff on the table. And they all threw their stuff on the table and they went, oh yeah, that's a great idea. Oh, that's a good story. Oh wait, he needs a servant. What should we call the servant? Oh, call him Tranio. Okay, great. Tranio is this. And I have to believe that that's kind of how a lot of them came together. And then he, as the chief writer and editor-in-chief, went through and cleaned them up, pared them down, rearranged scenes, fleshed out certain scenes, and in some cases near the end of his life, rewrote the entire play for posterity's sake so that it could be included in the first folio in the versions that we end up with from the first folio. So that's sort of what I've now, after all these years of studying this, that's the one I put my thumb on as I believe to be the most accurate, and also one of the reasons why it's so hard to nail it down, because there are a lot of pens involved.
So my question out there that I pose to anybody that sort of challenges the notion that this could be possible, that scenario that multiple people would contribute to a single person writing. think of your favorite song that's out there. Taylor Swift's the biggest artist right now. How many songs did Taylor Swift write? Sure, she probably wrote a handful of them, but for the most part, there's a songwriter writing that nobody will ever hear of. Your favorite movie character. Robert Downey Jr. is now cast as Dr. Doom, grew to fame as Iron Man. Can the average person name the person that wrote those scripts for him? Probably not. Think of every politician we have today. Think of the most famous speeches in history. The politicians that read them did not write them. They have speechwriters, a team of speechwriters that contribute to it. And so the idea that back then Ed DeVere is sitting down as the Earl of Oxford, pen to paper, and writing all these crafted stories, to me sounds more outrageous than the fact that he had a team of people around him doing exactly what you said, throwing him ideas, probably ghostwriting for him, doing the heavy legwork, kind of filling in the blanks. And he's just sort of coaching them along and building up his team and putting the message out there. And I don't think that it excludes the fact that other stories were drafted under Shakespeare's name that really had nothing to do with him. But you alluded to it earlier that it could have been used for propaganda. And I think that is also the case. And once you have now an esteemed figure at the top, you can kind of say whatever you want. We see it with our again, political accounts these days. Politicians aren't some of the politicians are not all of the politicians, I should say, are not on social media crafting these messages. They have a team of people that do it on their behalf. Celebrities do the same thing. It's that there's a team of people that are given a specific set of guidelines on what to write, and they put messages out under that name, under that pseudonym, and those messages get received or not received well by the public. So, yeah, you asked about parallels to today. That to me is what's become more fascinating. Is just politics have not changed from the Elizabethan era to today. Entertainment has not changed from the Elizabethan era to today. And if you look at today and the way everything lines up, it is identical. It gives you the answer to what probably happened back then. People express themselves through some sort of media, and they do it with a team of people. And sometimes they do it in a way that won't necessarily expose them to any sort of criticism or jeopardize their position of power. Because at the end of the day, that seems to be the recurring theme throughout history is people do things for power, for money, or for love. And in this case, I suspect it's at least two of the three of those here.
Well, one of the things about the one thing that is different and has changed rapidly in just the last couple of decades, back then it was more difficult to get messages out, but easier to control the message. So when you had a populace that nearly, upwards of 85 to 90% of the populace who cannot read and write, then the message has to be presented on the stage. It has to be presented through visuals. And that's how you fire up the people and get the people to believe and think the way you want them to. Today with social media, you can put out a social media campaign of post after post after post and influence after influencer and hit far more people in a faster way and in a larger variety of ways. It is harder to control all of the messaging. But as we have seen over recent years, when you have a media conglomerate that is basically owned by 6 men in the world who own all of the major outlets, if those 6 men sit in a room together and decide this is the message, we're screwed. We would really be like, people love him or hate him, but at least you have an Elon Musk who said, no, I don't want to sit with those 6 men in that room.
Yep.
I want to have my own message, and I don't care what those other 6 men want to tell me what to do or say or think. I'm not going to do that. And that's that's our reality. But if you go back to Elizabethan times, it wasn't 6 men. It was maybe 1 woman and 3 men who were controlling everything that went out there, right? And so I think that is an interesting parallel. But one of the big differences that I did hear recently, I heard, speaking of politicians, I heard a politician, and it was one of the most honest things I think I've heard a politician say in a very long time. And basically the comparison he was making is, as you pointed out, it used to be that there'd be a group of speech writers who all sat in a room together and helped a politician craft their message. Maybe that team was 2 or 3 people. Maybe it was 5 people. They tended to be people who had experience in writing books, history, sometimes literature, sometimes journalism, and but definitely a background in politics, that they had grown up through the years. And when a president of the United States needed a good speech, or a candidate for office needed a good speech, they called upon this sort of cachet of well-known speechwriters. And if they could get this one, they would. And some of those speechwriters would cross over both lines too. They'd write speeches for Democrats. They'd write speeches for Republicans, whoever was the highest bidder. It didn't matter. Their ideology didn't matter. What mattered is that this is what they did, and they did it well. And if you were going to pay me to do it, I'm going to do it. But this politician I heard the other day say, that's not how it is anymore. Now the messages that are going out under the name of a politician are actually being crafted by 23-year-old social media influencers who have not been in politics all their lives, who have not been in journalism, who basically barely have a degree. But because they know how to work Instagram really well, they're suddenly the voice of a campaign. And that is a huge transition and a giant change from what we used to have to what we have today.
Yeah. It's exactly that. It's a big transition. You see it. It's political season. I'm sure everyone's seeing ads right now, but when you see memes or dances made up or specific messaging, that's not made up by a 35-year Washington experienced former politician or campaign manager. That is somebody that's young and that is appealing to that young hip crowd. I think one of the big pieces that I've realized, and it ties back to the era to now, is people that shoo off conspiracy theories in general tend to always ask the question, how did nobody spill the beans in this? How did you get everybody to cooperate? So on and so forth. And I quite literally had this conversation yesterday with a friend about another conspiracy. And I don't think people understand that it doesn't take a whole lot of people to execute a narrative. You just mentioned that 6 people effectively run all the media. And there's a meme that floats around on the internet every once in a while where all the news broadcasts are reading the exact same script the whole way through across the entire country. Just about every major city in the United States, I can only speak for, has a news station that's broadcasting out there. Major cities, not small ones. And so for every one of them, let's just say there's a couple thousand out there, even 10,000. Every single one of those stations is spitting out the exact same message because those messages are coming down from 6 people. Those people that are on the front lines, they don't know what they're just reading and doing their job, right? So you can be saying something and painting a picture of a narrative that you don't know what the message is behind it. And so I think that's one big point of contention I always like to bring up. When people analyze these types of theories, don't do so thinking that there's going to be a whistleblower at every stage of this. For the most part, the people involved, whether it's that social media influencer or whether it's the person, sitting there scribing next to Ed DeVere, they might not even know what they're doing. They're just doing what they're told to do to collect a paycheck and continue on with their life because this is something they might enjoy or at least something that pays the bills. Whereas the person at the top is the one sort of steering the message and making sure that this gets executed along the way. So I just wanted to kind of throw that in there too, because it aligns very well to that same piece. Is just because a handful of people, or I guess just because a lot of people were involved the whole way through in the process of drafting some of these works of Shakespeare, doesn't mean that, especially at that particular time in the timeline, that they really knew what they were doing or the impact that they would end up having.
Well, one of the things we find about this Shakespeare authorship mystery is that it's pretty evident as you dive into it, that there were plenty of people at the top and plenty of people within the Elizabethan court who knew all the details. They knew the truth. It was, and I heard Chuck Todd I think he works for NBC. He's a longtime journalist, and he used a term recently that I saw him on air talking about, obviously not this topic, but he used a term that I thought, oh my goodness, that term applies so well to Shakespeare authorship. He said it's a non-versation. meaning that it's something that everyone knows but nobody talks about. And
Interesting.
I thought, well, that's exactly what was happening in Elizabethan England. There were a lot of non-versations going on. Non-versations about the Queen's lust and how many lovers she had. You couldn't talk about that. To talk about that was death. Non-versations
right.
about succession to the throne, because to talk about a potential prince or a potential successor was treason. And P.S., death. Non-versations about who was really Shakespeare and who's really writing these plays that are stirring up the English commoners to support the Queen and rally against a potential Spanish invasion. There were non-versations about the Queen getting married or not getting married. And when she started flirting with the idea of getting married, one guy made the mistake of writing a pamphlet about it and lost his hand. So, I think that when you look at it, if somebody like a modern journalist today, like Chuck Todd, for instance, can use the term non-versation in speaking about a thing that is happening in the Beltway, in Washington, D.C., in politics, that everyone knows but nobody's talking about. If it can happen today in a world of so many media outlets and social media and all of that, it could so easily happen in a totalitarian structure like Elizabethan England, where there really aren't a lot of media outlets. And if you write the wrong thing, you lose your hand or your head. So if a conglomeration of elitists and media people can get away with a deceit today, imagine how much easier it was to get away with that type of deceit in the 16th century.
That's interesting. You got me thinking too that, because it was a non-versation, after a generation of people, those stories start to wither away. And we've always heard growing up that history is written by the victors. And we can look to our recent past and find very prestigious leaders in our culture or idols that had darker, checkered personal lives as well. And those things are not talked about because it ruins the reputation of who that person was or the contribution they made to push something forward, right? And so when you look at who Queen Elizabeth was and her impact, or really influence, I guess is really the correct word, of that era, there's never going to be anything within her immediate generation, but then subsequent generations after, the stories will get lost because they're just, like you said, with the non-versation, they're just never being told again. And we don't want them to be told because that's going to change the complexion of what we thought about her, what we thought about that era, what we thought about any potential accomplishment that would have happened in that era. I love that word non-versation, and that adds a lot of context to a lot of historical happenings. It's not even just conspiracies, just happenings, and why everyone in the past is always looked at in this great light. They're not all great people, and they've all done some nasty things to be in the positions that they were in, but we never view them that way.
Well, and I always like to use a very modern reference. Right? I look at the current royalty, and I use that term loosely because it always shocks me that we live in a world that is as progressive as it is, but we still allow people on the planet to claim that they are superior to others because of their bloodline. Charles being the person I'm pointing to, Charles and the royals of England today. Like, that's just such a ridiculous premise in a world that is so evolved that we would allow anyone on the planet to say, I am superior to you because my DNA is better than yours. It's just like crazy ridiculous. But the thing I point to always is, and look at how we're seeing it play out now, is with Prince Harry, the flaming, fiery, curly, redheaded the redheaded stepchild, I always say, of Charles III. It was a non-versation that he was not Charles's legitimate son, that he is actually the son of the Royal Air Force captain that Princess Diana had an affair with while she and Charles were still married, and Charles was carrying on with Camilla. Everyone knows it. It just wasn't talked about. It was the non-versation of the day. But now the way it's played out with them as estranged from each other as they are, and Charles won't even speak to Harry anymore, and Harry basically has come out and said, that's not my dad. Now, was that a conspiracy theory when the little boy came out all curly red-haired and people started whispering? Was that a conspiracy theory, or was it just actual truth? And truth in a way that has been the case hundreds of times throughout English history, throughout the nobility, where people fathered illegitimate children and women gave birth to children that really weren't their husbands all the time. And yet it's so hard for some people to think that Edward and Elizabeth had a baby together.
I think the definition of conspiracy theory has taken turn over years, where people associate it to it being made up or not true. Whereas the definition, I think, pick a dictionary, label that off, is that it's any situation or any event that is the result of a secret intentional plot to deceive, right? And so I think it is a conspiracy theory. Now, that one just happens to be true. Yeah, that's where I would leave that one. Is I think their intention was to sweep it under the rug, to hide it, to not stir up any other drama there. It just so happened to materialize. You look at them like the royal family, like they're not supposed to have any flaws to them whatsoever, and then here they are with, by any religion, one of the biggest flaws of all, infidelity. And now you're ruining that sacrilegious bloodline, right? There's reasons why they want to keep that hidden, but like you said earlier, it's a different time and a different era, and that information gets out there a lot quicker these days.
Anointed by God to be the supreme ruler of his country. I mean, that's wow. Okay, buddy. This is 2024.
I don't know how you have a democracy. I don't know how you had democracy over there, claiming to have one, and you still have a royal family that, to the best of my knowledge, I'm not really sure what they even do. I mean, outside of being treated like royal, I mean, do they have any actual responsibility that's worth a damn over there? Or is it just figureheads? It's
very little.
Absurd.
They do a lot of charity work. They raise the only reason I can see that they continue to exist is because of the amount of tourism revenue they generate for the country. It's a GDP thing.
That makes a lot of sense.
It's literally gross domestic product, and they are a product. And that's the only thing I can imagine. And ironically, the largest consumer of that product is Americans. And you would think that us of all people would be the first people to say, screw that. I'm not paying any attention to that. That is horrendous. The fact that this man believes that he's superior to everyone because his DNA is better than everyone else's. How is that any different than I'm better than you because my skin is a different color than yours? To me, it's like the epitome of racism to the most extreme level. My bloodline is better than everyone's. I mean, that's as Hitler as you can get, isn't it? Truly.
Yep.
When you think about it, right? So it just blows my mind that we allow this to continue in today's day and age. But it demonstrates, I think, tying it back to the Shakespeare authorship mystery, it demonstrates the unyielding and undying power of the monarchy. And if we still have this unyielding, undying power today, imagine how much more intense it was and how strong it was back in the 16th century when the monarch still wielded the power of death. At the blink of an eye, at the snap of a finger, you are done, and you're done right now. And I don't think that modern societies can really understand what that means and how much that played a part in the non-versations of the day.
I'm going to give you something to think about, because you said that the monarch was stronger back then than they are today. It feels like it's smaller on the surface, but America, right? We elect a president. But when the president goes into the office, they are briefed on all of the biggest secrets. But the people briefing them could also choose not to tell them certain aspects if they deem it for national security. So who's really in charge? Is it the president of the United States, or is it somebody that we don't know, somebody that's unnamed? If you look through history, all the families, the very wealthy families that sort of define the way culture has been built, whether it's the Rothschilds or pick your favorite conspiracy-driven family there.
When I was a kid, my
There's
mother used to
meetings-
say, "Turn off the lights. Who do I look like? John D. Rockefeller?"
The Rothschilds too, yeah. Right, exactly, right? I often wonder, right after we did our episode on Shakespeare, we did one on the Titanic, and it was kind of right in that same area that a lot of this stuff went down. There was conspiracies around that. But the names that kept coming up were all the same names, and the affiliations were all the same affiliations. I tend to wonder if the monarch still exists and we just aren't as aware of it because, unlike England, they're not necessarily pronouncing themselves. They're a figurehead for the world to see. But perhaps there is that group of people, there is that royal bloodline operating behind the scenes and pulling all the strings everywhere.
Well, certainly a lot of those families, those noble, quote unquote, families, and all of those titles, the Earl of this and the Duke of that, certainly a lot of them make up the parliament. Many of the prime minister, many of the parliamentary ministers are members of a lot of those long-standing families. So yes, and indeed, there is still an aristocracy there, regardless of them claiming that they're a democracy. The aristocracy still maintains a tremendous amount of control. I believe that's true, yes. And I believe that in our country, we have elevated our own aristocracy. The only difference is it is possible for a quote-unquote commoner to advance themselves into the oligarchy, into the aristocracy, without it having to be years and years of it being handed down through their family and this estate and these lands and etc. So I think that's the only difference. But I do believe that our elites still model themselves after that elite system. And in fact, I think part of the problem is you do have a certain number of them who I would say are the nouveau riche of the American aristocracy who are insecure about it. And so they fight harder to obtain and maintain whatever power they are able to achieve. I would say, yeah, I think that's accurate. Getting back though,
the world is a crazy place.
Getting back though to the idea of the Shakespeare authorship mystery as a conspiracy theory, one of the questions I've wanted to ask you is, based on the now score or more, at least one score or more, conspiracy theories that you have really done a deep dive into, would you say that the Shakespeare authorship mystery qualifies as a true conspiracy theory in comparison to some of the others that you have examined?
Unequivocally, yes. It's when people ask me episodes to listen to, we don't have a huge catalog of them, but I say the most underrated one you'll listen to is the Shakespeare authorship mystery. There's just so many twists and turns in it to me, just so many nuances in it to me, especially when you start to dive into the relationship between Ed DeVere and Queen Elizabeth. It's something I never even knew about. I don't think you can. I mean, it reads like a Shakespeare story, the entire conspiracy. I don't think you can say it's not. If there's any element of mystery to me or any element of a cover-up, it's got to be a conspiracy to me. And I think there's enough evidence that would indicate that what we're told about Shakespeare is not true. And I think that's pretty well accepted. I know, mainstream schooling is not going to tell you that. They're going to tell you Shakespeare is Shakespeare. But I think in general, as you start to open this book up a little bit and you start to look into, just type in Shakespeare authorship into search. Google's notorious for kind of pressing down a lot of conspiracy theories if it's like really off the shelf, but you can still find enough that at least opens the question: was Shakespeare not who it was? And there's derivatives of, was it a woman? Was it other people? So on and so forth. But I think the fact that question exists and is not a definitive person, that's a conspiracy to me. And that's a conspiracy that sounds like more people are open to kind of looking into now.
So one of the things that you have to have come across through your variety of episodes and the different ones that you've attacked, and I say that word, loosely, obviously, but I would think that part of your mission is, if possible, wherever possible, almost like Mythbusters, would be to disprove certain conspiracy theories, if possible. Have there been any that you've dove into and went, all right, this is a bunch of bullshit. This is not actually a thing. This is a tinfoil hat thing, and we're going to disprove it and move on to something else?
So it's kind of a fine line, because we want to be able to hear everybody out. We had an episode with somebody that had an alien encounter. His name was Mike, and I suspect he probably won't listen to this, but if he does, Mike, I hope I don't offend you in saying any of this stuff. But he described his alien encounter, and we actually wrestled with the idea of publishing it because it was kind of outrageous. And I believe in aliens, right? We talked about that earlier today. It's something that I'm not talking about because it's just an interest of mine. It's because I believe to some degree there's something out there. But when my co-host and I talked about it, we said that if nothing else, Mike believes in his story. We looked up a lot of the things he said in terms of the locations where this encounter happened. I used Google Maps, and it's a beautiful thing about Google Maps, and I was able to zoom into the playgrounds he was talking about. I mean, it is identical to the way he described it. Now, he lives in the area, so of course it's just recollection from there, but the way he described the whole story, the way he was reacting when he was doing it. I've studied a lot of body language in my time too, so the way your head turns a certain way when you're talking about things can indicate where your eyes go, can indicate whether you're telling the truth or lying. And Mike seemed to give off all impressions and body language that he was telling the truth. Whether or not it happened, complete mystery. It could just be something going on. Maybe his memory's not the same as it used to, but he believed it. And he wrote to us afterwards and expressed a lot of gratitude for being given the opportunity to tell his story in a respectful manner. And so that kind of spoke to us at that point and changed our perspective on how we wanted to approach a lot of these topics. Is we didn't want to come into them with the intention of dispelling anything. We want to be realists, which is literally where the name came from. Is I'm not going into this saying that, oh, well, this is true, so this, and that have to be true, and everything is conspiracy and blah, blah, blah. No. I believe that some things are coincidence, and I believe that not everything is a conspiracy. Sometimes it's just a happy accident or a mistake or whatnot. There are some theories out there that I suspect are probably not going to be true. And there is an episode that we recorded that we completely dispelled it. That episode is called Ong's Hat, and it's about a place right here in New Jersey, which is effectively about a bunch of Princeton scientists that came down here in the late 80s, and they were doing some government experiments in Princeton, and they decided they wanted to take an escape. They went down to Ong's Hat, New Jersey, which is effectively a ghost town in the middle of the Pinelands, woodsy area. So they're going to go camping. And to summarize it up, they basically discovered interdimensional travel and left Earth. And there's a lot to that story that would lead one to believe that it was very true, including papers that are written and published by Princeton University scientists under a pseudonym that was from Ong's Hat, New Jersey. So very easy to trace the story based on reality. However, we know it's false because the person we had on as a guest is actually the person that wrote the story originally. And so we were able to dispel that story with the original author of it. And he explained everything from top to bottom and has sufficient proof that, the story was built around his name being the reporter. He was the reporter. He's got all the documentation to prove it. So that was a fun one to talk about. Where we're able to kind of put it to rest without offending anybody or insulting anybody. So
it wasn't really a conspiracy theory. It was a science fiction story that people chose to believe. Sort of like
it was
Orson Welles in the 30s on Mercury Radio doing War of the Worlds and people freaking out and thinking that alien invasion was really happening while they listened to their radios, right?
Right. Well, that is exactly what it was. And it was at a time he started releasing the stories in the 90s. So he was doing it via pamphlets, sort of like mail chains from the back of magazines and telling the story. But he positioned himself with his real name as this conspiracy reporter that was investigating all the stuff. The conspiracy really ties to the fact that there were papers that were being written on interdimensional travel by Princeton scientists. He just elaborated on the truth to make it science fiction. Conspiracy took a life of its own. And when he tried to say that it was all made up, nobody believed him. And the issue then became that people were finding him and going to his house thinking that he found the device and he was hiding it from them, or that the government came and shut him up and that he became a government asset. So it actually, like, he felt very threatened for his life. So that's really where the conspiracy took wing, is people thought he was lying about it. People thought that he had the key to this interdimensional travel. He had this device. But yeah, it's, at the end of the day, that's all it was. It was a story. It was a story at a time when there was a lot of those alternate reality type games happening in the 80s, where people would sign up for mailing lists and get different stories that just happened to be rooted in some degree of truth.
There is a company,
very much like the John Titor story.
I can't remember the name of the company right now off the top of my head, but I'm a simple internet search, I'm sure we'll be able to find it if you're interested in this. But there's a company out there that sells these experiences, and you pay a fee and you give them the information on the person that you want to gift this to. And they send like the first mailing to that person, and it has some details in it and some information and some clues. And then they send them another mailing that usually says a package will be coming to you with more details. And then the package arrives with more clues and more details. And then at the end, they get like the reveal that it's all just fiction and it's all for fun. But they're some of them are kind of creepy, some of them are murder mystery types. And I sent one to a cousin of mine. He's the type of guy who has everything. And I was like, this is a perfect gift for my cousin, because he's the man who has everything. And this is something he definitely will enjoy. When we were growing up together, we played a lot of bookshelf games. We played a lot of role-playing games together. Sure. And I thought, he's going to love this. So I paid the fee and I signed him up and I gave them his information. And then a month went by. I didn't hear anything. Another month went by. I didn't hear anything. Finally, 3 months went by and I'm like, this should be playing out by now. And he should have contacted me by now to say, hey, that was cool. I enjoyed it. Thanks. So finally I called and I got his wife on the phone and I was talking to her and I was like, hey, I sent my cousin this thing and I haven't heard. And she went, oh my God, that was you? She said, the package is sitting here in our living room. We've been afraid to open it. The first two mailings were so suspicious. We called our local police department. He called the FBI. I was like, oh my God.
Wow. Was it that crazy?
Yeah. I can't remember the name of the company. But obviously they did a remarkable job with their documents and their letters and the way they create these things, right? They obviously did a remarkable job because they were completely fooled and they were terrified to open the package. And I said, open the package and play the mystery out through the clues. It's just a mail order game thing. And no, you're fine. It's fine.
That's so cool.
Each one of their scenarios comes with some sort of a keepsake. And this one was like a starred map, because I chose the one that was like space and star maps. And it involved, the reason I brought it up is because it involved some sort of interdimensional travel angle to it.
Right.
And now he has this, nicely crafted leather piece that hangs on his wall that has the maps of these stars and constellations and solar systems that supposedly are the key to interdimensional travel, that it hangs in his office now. But yeah, that's a true story.
That is amazing.
They were freaked out.
That is amazing.
I can't remember the name of the company. I'll have to look it up now, and I'll share
I
it.
want that name when you find it.
Yeah,
So
I'll
cool.
put it on. I'll put it on a post on our social media, on our Patreon page, to accompany this episode, so that listeners can find it. Because if you have someone in your life who is, and a lot of us do, especially those of us who are involved in the Shakespeare authorship mystery, we do have people in our lives who have everything, who would love this kind of an adventure. But I will warn you, some of them are a little creepy, and I didn't go with the creepy. I went with the more mysterious, but it still freaked them out. So you may have to tell people. It may not be a surprise. You may have to say, "I'm sending you something. Don't freak out."
Depending on what their personality is like.
Yeah. They flipped out. It cracked me up. She was so mad. His wife was very mad because it really caused them like stress and anguish.
I'm sure.
But he and I had a very good laugh over it afterwards. So
we live in such like a digital world where everything is easy to predict and control. Even when we had our children, I never wanted to know the sex of either of my children. We waited till they were born, and everyone thought we were crazy for doing that. I said, I know everything about my life. My calendar is regimented. Like my life is very predictable. Like I control every aspect of my life. I couldn't control that. So I think that to have a game like that, that's kind of taking you out of the element. It's paper, but you're not getting mail really anymore. It's spam, right? Literally spam in your mailbox. So to get something like that, I realized that maybe it's a little bit of a rush if you're not expecting it, but I don't know, that the adventure of it to me that's fun to found that out at the end.
Last year for my birthday, really cool. My wife found a very similar type of service she signed me up for, and it was historical documents. And for about 6 months, once a month, they would send me in the mail an envelope with a reproduction of an actual historical letter. One was like a letter from Abraham Lincoln to one of his cabinet members. One was a letter from Ben Franklin to one of his close friends that he wrote from Paris and sent back to the United States while he was there as an emissary of the nation in its early years of founding. It was really fascinating and a lot of fun. They would send you basically a photocopy reproduction, full color. Mm-hmm. And then they would send you a typed transcript of it, because some of these men, their cursive writing, I mean, we joke about how young people can't write or read cursive. Well, some of them, their script was so flowery, or in some cases, the letter was so weathered and aged that some of the print was a little blurry or faded.
I believe it.
So they would send you like a transcript copy so that you could read it just in plain print as well. And it was a really fun little gift. Also just, one of those things that you give somebody who has everything. And that inspired me.
That's pretty cool.
We live here in Southern Oregon on 4 acres of forest. And we live where two rivers combine. The Rogue River and the Applegate River kind of feed into each other not far from our home. And you can go up the Rogue River from the Oregon coast at a city called Gold Beach. And I got inspired by these two incidents of this sort of, historical documents or mystery type of a thing. And I went online and I ordered a wooden chest, and I went to eBay and I found someone who was selling like bags of costume jewelry really cheap. And I filled the wooden chest with all this costume jewelry and this giant piece of red glass that looks like a cut ruby that's actually a paperweight. And I threw them in the chest and I buried them in our backyard. And then I got some parchment paper and I drew out sketches of 6 different places on our property that were distinguished by trees or other landmarks, and wrote these clues in rhyme on the backside, tea-stained the document in dark tea so that it looked all old and weathered, cut it into pieces and rolled them up and stuck them in bottles and capped the bottles and buried the bottles at each of the locations that led to the next location. And then I handcrafted a fake letter on the same type of parchment paper in disguised handwriting, sealed it with some sealing wax, and convinced my children that I'd been told by a neighbor that there was a rumor of hidden buried treasure on our property, and that I was going to go to the Historical Society and do some research. And upon returning from that day, I brought back this letter. I said they had this letter in their files, and they let me check it out. Let's read it and see what it tells us. And it was the story of this ship's captain who was literally a real guy. I did my research, right? So I made it as real as possible.
That's awesome.
Real admiral of the American Southern Fleet in the 1780s who conquered these Mexican pirates off the coast of Mexico who had stolen the jewels from one of the Mayan temples there. And so I told the children that the main jewel was the heart of Quetzalcoatl. And this Admiral Brownson had defeated the pirates, confiscated their treasure, and then was supposed to sail it up the coast to Portland. But along the way, found Gold Beach, ventured up the Rogue River, and buried it somewhere near where the Rogue and Applegate rivers meet. And it might be right here on our property. And we, for the whole winter, that was our adventure. Each week we would follow a new clue to find a new bottle that we would dig up that had a new clue. And eventually we got to the treasure and dug up the treasure. And we had such a blast. And I think my eldest has maybe figured out that it was all planned by daddy. But I think my two young ones still believe that we're sitting on millions of dollars in treasure in a little wooden box in our living room. And we displayed the heart in a nice little stand on our hutch. And so now we have this giant ruby that they believe is worth millions of dollars. So I'm a theater guy, so that's the kind of stuff that theater dads do.
I can tell. That is amazing. That is such a cool experience. What an amount of effort to go through just to create a family memory in and of itself right there. But to actually be able to do that and have the kids enjoy it, it's so cool. I might steal that actually.
I started posting about it on my Facebook page. Oh, I went to the Historical Society and found this letter. And then I took a picture of the letter and I, posted a photo of the letter and then talked about the contents of the letter and started sharing the details. And I get this text message from a buddy of mine and he says, dude, you need to stop posting that stuff because if you find that treasure, people are going to come after you. He was totally in it. Like he had totally been duped. He fell for it, hook, line, and sinker. And he started saying, is this real? And I said, well, look it up. Have you looked it up? He said, I did. I Googled it all. He was a real guy and that was a real battle. And blah, 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 blah. Finally, I had to let him off the hook and say, it's just an adventure for my kids, man. I'm just having a fun winter. It was a cold, wet winter, and it's just something fun for the kids and I to do every weekend. I had to let him off the hook. So the point being is just another example of you got to be careful with some of these things because people are gullible.
That's for sure. That is for sure. Yep. Especially when you marry it to something that's true. I mean, that's always been the staple of any good story or any good conspiracy itself is people latch onto that and then you can tell them it's fake. But once they kind of go down that rabbit hole, sometimes it's hard to pull them back out of it.
Well, circling back to some of the things we've talked about in the episode, the best lies are based in reality and the best propaganda is based in projection. So I accuse my opponent of what I am actually guilty of. And that way it's deference. So nobody looks at what I'm doing while they're too busy examining what my opponent is doing. And we see that happen all the time, especially in today's landscape where we're so divided and everybody's pointing fingers at everybody. But they're all guilty of it. And, the man who knew this the best was our author. Our author understood this. And when you look at some of his plays, like I just recently did an episode on Measure for Measure and the aspects of justice from Measure for Measure. And, one of the major themes of that play is everyone's doing it. Everyone's guilty on both sides. They're all guilty of this kind of corruption. They're all guilty of this type of salacious behavior. It's just a matter of who's getting away with it and who is not. And so he understood the aristocracy of his time because he was a member of the aristocracy of his time. And no commoner from Stratford would have ever been allowed to get away with pointing that kind of finger at the nobility as being so corrupt and so full of, the hedonistic behavior that is basically spelled out in that play. No commoner would have ever been allowed to do that. And so that's just another one of those.
Lost you.
Yeah, you would have lost a hand or a head. Indeed. Well, Shane, it's been a fun conversation, and I've really enjoyed having you. Before we wrap things up, I do want to ask you, what's coming up? Like, what are you planning? Are you planning to revisit any? Have you found any conspiracy theories that you felt like, we just didn't cover it enough, we need to go back and do it again? Are you planning anything new with regards to the Shakespeare authorship mystery? And what's in the queue for you?
Man, those are a lot of good questions. It's one of the nice things about being in this world of mystery is that I think there are always threads to pull. And we generally try to keep our episodes to about an hour. Most of them, especially when we have a guest, go to an hour and a half to 2 hours because there's so much that we're pulling on. I think at some point we're going to try to revisit quite a few of them. We're trying not to do it yet. We're trying to see if we can get through a bunch of topics right out of the gate, so that way we're not pigeonholing ourselves into one specific topic more than others. But I think we'll for sure be back in the Shakespeare authorship mystery. I do want to explore some of the other theories outside of Ed de Vere. I'm pretty convinced in just my research that is the answer, but I don't want to necessarily close my mind to what those other conspiracies are. And so I think a future episode is just maybe more of a blanket discussion on some of the other topics that are out there, some of the other speculations that are out there, just to kind of see what else is there and see if that changes my opinion at all.
I totally understand. We do that here. Sometimes I get flack from listeners who say, why'd you have that person on and their crazy theory about Marlowe? Or why'd you have this person on and their crazy theory about North? Or this crazy theory about Anne Hathaway wrote all the plays? Because every stone is worth looking under. And each time you explore any theory, it only demonstrates further that what we've been told is not the truth. And that's part of my position on it all. Also, I feel like everyone has something to contribute, because in every way that they explore what they believe the true writer to be, they're always knocking down the fake writer. And that's a win for all of us.
Yeah, I think that's well said. Marlowe was actually one of the ones that came up quite a bit when I started this research. And so to your point, I tend to believe there's probably a little bit of truth in everything. Otherwise, a conspiracy wouldn't come to surface. Why that truth exists, I don't know. And I tend to also think that sometimes we fill in the blanks for the things that we don't know, and we sort of just accept it as fact. So, if Edward de Vere was the guy, is the whole story correct? Maybe not. Maybe he was the guy, but there are other angles to it that we aren't considering. And so, to your point, I think the more you dive into those rabbit holes, maybe you come out the other side with a little nugget of knowledge that just kind of opens your eyes up or makes that original theory a little stronger. One of the fun things about conspiracies is you can change your opinion. You can prove something further, or you can disprove something or dispel it and sort of knock it down. So in any of those cases, I think it's fun to do. In terms of timeline on that, what I think we're loosely shooting for is to revisit a lot of our episodes again next January. It won't be the exact 1 year for some of the episodes, and I don't think we'll hit on every single one. But we talked about MK Ultra earlier before. there's so many threads I could pull on that we can go in different directions. So we might try to realign them a little bit and say, do another version of MK Ultra, do another one in Shakespeare, and so on and so forth from there, just to have some fun with it and see what reaction we get from it as well.
And new episodes drop how often?
With regards, yeah. So right now we're coming out with new episodes every Thursday. That's on YouTube and Spotify. We post them on social channels as well. Our upcoming ones, we did the Trump assassination attempt that came out last Thursday. This Thursday coming up, we're actually speaking with the director of Died Suddenly, which was the documentary that came from that kind of took the social media by storm. It was the COVID vaccine and stuff that happened with that. The following week, I got to pull up my schedule here. I know we've got Ong's Hat coming up. I believe that is in 2 weeks. That's one we talked about a little bit before, that we sort of dispelled a little bit. Oh, you know what? The following week we don't have scheduled yet because we're recording that tonight. That is why it's not on my schedule here. And that's going to be about some theories about the Grand Canyon. I'm like, oh man, I thought we had summer is so hard to record sometimes. There's so much going on. But we found a really cool one about the Grand Canyon. There are so many conspiracies around that, which again, I never even heard of until a couple days ago. So you know what, this would be fun to talk to.
Oh, I can't wait for that. I look forward to that one because I watched a thing not too long ago that had a geologist on who was standing at the bottom of the Grand Canyon and talking about the layers that were deposited there. And his theory was that it was evidence of the great flood of the Bible, that the layers had been deposited there through massive amounts of movements of water.
Right.
As opposed to being cut through time. His thing was, no, this is not something that's been cut over time and gone down, down, down because of this river running for billions of years. This was a massive water occurrence that deposited these layers one on top of another as massive waves pushed silt here, there, and everywhere. And I thought, wow, that's an incredible theory. I'd like to hear more about that.
It's that theme of a massive flood has been recurring in so many topics that we've looked at in terms of ancient architecture. It kind of likens back to that Younger Dryas, which was, I want to say like 11 to 12,000 years ago, somewhere in that time frame. And that's another one that I want to pull on that a lot further too, because you look at Bible stories and any story in any context, and whether you subscribe to the Bible or not, I'm not questioning anybody's religious beliefs or anything like that, but stories come from somewhere. Any of these stories, the stories we're talking about today, stories from your religious beliefs, anything, there's always rooted in some degree of truth. And just like you mentioned with the Grand Canyon, with ancient Egypt, they talk about the same thing with the pyramids. You see underground cities, or underwater cities. There's so many things that they're fascinating. So it goes back to your question earlier in the beginning. There's so many other topics that pop up. And I sometimes like going into them a little bit blind, because we'll do some of the research right in the episode is just try to look at things up. When we did something on Göbekli Tepe, we literally pulled up pictures of it and we're walking through it on Google Maps, Google Earth, and just kind of making discoveries right there. It's part of the fun of all the storytelling. So
well, you have a great journey ahead of you, my friend. Once a week, that's a tough schedule. My hat's off to you for that one. But as you say that, there's plenty of content. There's no doubt about that. Let me tell you, as I'm into well beyond the latter half of the 6th year of this and more than 135 episodes. You'll never run out of topics and interesting guests. I promise you that, because it hasn't been a problem for me. So I'm certainly, it won't be a problem for you. I want to thank you again for sharing your time and your information with us. Ladies and gentlemen, he is Shane Squarek. That's spelled Skwarek. Skwarek. You can find more about Shane and, of course, Conspiracy Realist at conspiracyrealist.com. It's pretty simple. Conspiracyrealist.com. You can also look for them on YouTube or Spotify or other podcast platforms. That's where you will find them. And Shane, thank you again for joining us.
I appreciate you having me. This is a ton of fun.
Hey, fellow Quillers, before I let you go, I just wanted to give a few shout outs to some of you and fill the rest of you in on a little bit of business. First, I'd like to shout out to Ron Raphael, who sends me an email after just about every episode. Thanks, Ron, for being such a loyal listener and for your many comments. I do receive your emails, and you often make some very great points. Keep the emails coming, everyone. You know you can reach me by sending an email to contact@don'tquillthepodcast.com. Contact@don'tquillthepodcast.com. So many of you reached out to me about my recent solo episode about Measure for Measure. And I'm so glad that you all enjoyed it. I'd like to give a special shout out to Anne Rutan and Rich Wood, who both sent me the nicest compliments on my solo episodes and asked for more. And what I can tell you all is that I am working on a couple more. So don't fret. It's just I've also had so many awesome guests lined up, and there is only so much time. But I do enjoy doing the research and preparing those solo episodes for you every once in a while, and I do have a couple more that I am working on. So there'll be more of those to come indeed. But thank you so much for your kind emails and compliments. You made my day. I love pianist Don Moore's recent comments that he sent me about finding the value in art and the opinions of others, even when we disagree with those persons on major issues or philosophies. Thanks for that reminder, Don. It sure is important that we continue to maintain an open mind about what it is that we're focused on and dismiss some of the other issues that may be dividing us as human beings. So thank you for that. Also, thanks to those of you who sent messages about the recent tribute episode to Alexander Waugh. It was nice to hear from so many of you who felt that Earl and I did a decent job with the episode. Thank you for that. One of the great advantages to the chemistry Earl and I have developed through many episodes together over the years is I think it allows us to touch on just about any subject, no matter how sensitive or somber it might be. It was indeed an important episode, and I'm glad that everyone appreciated it. And now, because of the circumstances of this month's episodes, including that one, we are way behind in announcing the August Quiller of the month. So without further ado, here is our very own producer, Jake, to spin the wheel of destiny and announce this month's winner.
Thank you, Stephen, and hello, Quiller Nation. 'Tis I, producer Jake, once again given the great honor of naming August's official Quiller of the month. I apologize for the audio quality, recording this on my phone because my fiance and I are deep in the heart of Texas on our journey back to Los Angeles from the East Coast, stopping and spending a little bit of time in what is an incredibly large state. And so once again, I apologize for the quality, but listen, the Quillers always come first. No matter where in the world I am, I will always have time for the Quillers. So if you're not sure what this is, head on over to patreon.com/don'tquillthemessenger and find out. Each and every month, all eligible Quillers are put into this drawing, and the winner gets the item of their choosing from the shop over at dragonwagonshop.com, as well as the clout of being Quiller of the month for all of time. You get your name etched into history books. So without further ado, the official Quiller of the month for August is Stephen Hopkins. Stephen Hopkins, thank you so much. Thanks to each and every one of you for your continued support of the program. We very earnestly could not, would not, should not do this show without you all. So thanks again, and back to you, Steve.
Thank you, Jake. Always a pleasure to have you. I know the listeners love to hear from you now and again. And congratulations to our winner. Hey, just one more thing before we go. Thank you all so much for your continued support of the program and your loyal listenership. I know we say it often, but truly, this series is for you, Quiller Nation, and we couldn't do it without you, nor would we want to. With that said, I have just one small ask from you all. Share the series with someone, won't you? At least one person you know out there might enjoy learning about this great mystery too. And if each of you just shared the show with one other person, look how much the Quiller Nation could grow and expand to reach more open minds, to create new super sleuths aimed at getting to the truth. So go out there and send a link to your favorite episode to someone you know. Spark a conversation about podcasts. Find out what others are listening to and then tell them what you're listening to. The only way to shift this paradigm is to open up this mystery to more people, one new person at a time. So I know it's an ask. It's not a giant ask. It might be somewhat of a big ask. And I know that sometimes we get afraid of looking like the tin hat wearing people with conspiracy theory punched, across our chest. But look at lately how many quote unquote conspiracy theories have been suddenly proven to be not theories, but fact. And this is one of those, I think, as well. So have no fear. Go out and share the series with someone, would you please? Just one person each. That's all I ask. You can do it, Quiller Nation. I believe in you. And until next time, keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
It's Dragon Wagon.